Hello, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast. The Postmodern Iconoclast is a podcast that breaks and destroys the false idols and icons of the digital age in search of a more authentic, esoteric spirituality. I'm your host, Georgina Rose, and today I have a lovely guest on who, if you listen to the show regularly, you will 100% be familiar with this guest. They are the person who comes on this show the most. And today we're going to be discussing a subject that I think is perennially relevant, and that is the idea of the armchair magician. So, the armchair magician is a slang term that's used extensively in the occult community, both online and in the real life world. And often the term armchair magician is discussed in a very negative way. And in this podcast, we're going to be discussing what one is, what one isn't, and if you think you are an armchair magician and you want to change that situation, how to actually change that situation and become an active practitioner. But before we get into the conversation, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. I am Dave, also known as Dave the Amateur Magus. I run the YouTube channel Amateur Magus. I also come on this podcast whenever I'm asked to because it's a fun experience. So, hello, I'm back again for those of you who remember seeing the previous ones.
Yeah, I think that your episodes are some of the ones people listen to the most, and I don't even know how many times I've had you come on the show at
I,
this
I
point.
think last time I was on, I asked, am I finally beating? I think it's Schizotopia.
Yeah, you've beaten Schizotopia for most returns to this show. So at this point, you could be like an honorary friend of the pod or
I'm
something.
I'm a seasonal guest host at this point.
Yeah, there we go. That's
There
a
we
good
go.
title
That
for
works.
it. But to start this conversation, I think we need to start with what an armchair magician is, because I think this term is kind of unclear. I mean, really, the only time I see it used is kind of in arguments. Like, I think this term is fundamentally an insult. Do you think so?
This term is not a term that most people would willingly put on themselves, I don't think. Usually, if they are, it's coming from a place of, like, I don't know what I'm doing. So, when I first encountered this, it was in a time when the scholarly pursuit of occultism was not really a thing, or if it was, the people who were scholarly and were actually studying this, like, professionally in academia were not engaging in the conversation at all. This was at a time when, or at least in spaces where, when you had somebody who wasn't practicing, that was an armchair. But that definition has kind of evolved a little bit. So there's kind of two different types of people with a very strong interest in occultism that don't practice. And the first is the academic scholars who are studying this from, like, an academic, more historical perspective. And then you have the actual armchairs who are the people who are studying this as more of a casual hobbyist enthusiast, but then proceed to try to tell magicians that they have actually not met certain entities that all the correspondence is fit for because this other book that they read says that they've done it wrong, despite the fact that they've read like four books and they all contradict each other.
Yeah, and I actually think there's a third category, and I'm going to call them the amateur scholars. So they're people who are not academic scholars of the occult, but kind of just study this stuff for fun and find it interesting. I think there's a lot of people who are in like the philosophy space who like will read occult books and have no interest of practicing and just kind of do their own like fascination in it. And I think if we're calling these people armchairs, like they're not really like my problem with the term armchair is I think the term armchair occultist or armchair magician implies a practitioner. And I think some of these groups that we're describing are people who don't really have a desire to practice, right? Like if you just read about the occult and your only interest in it is from like just a intellectual interest, is it really an insult to call you someone who doesn't practice, right? Like I think that's kind of its own thing, and I think that's a legitimate interest. Also, on the scholar people, I mean, a lot of people who are scholars, and I think this needs to be brought up. If you work in academia, and I've known people who work in occult academia, I've had conversations with them, they're not really socially allowed to say they practice, right? Like if you're studying the academic world of the occult, and there's a bunch of scholars that I'm sure some people are thinking of, like some people who even write books on the subject, like very much in private are practitioners, but they can't say they are practitioners because then the other people in religious scholarship academia will look down on them or not take their work as seriously. And so those people kind of feel forced to pretend that they just have an intellectual interest in it. So I think that's an extra level of complexity that needs to be brought into the scholar conversation, because some of those people aren't armchair occultists. Some of them are active practitioners. They just kind of can't say that and remain being credible in the academic sphere.
Yeah, and that is very different because academia, despite the fact that people are studying it in academia, occultism does kind of have a bit of a reputation. Obviously, it's usually linked to things called pseudoscience by academia, kind of rightfully so because they really don't have any bearing on science and their own thing or their more spiritual sciences. But you aren't really supposed to be practicing non non-concrete sciences in academia. So it's kind of a very different thing where you can't really practice occultism. But when it comes to armchairs, I always think of it like this. I always think of the armchair as the person who has no experience, the person who does not engage with the subject they're reading. They're kind of like a person who studies a bunch of math or watches a bunch of science content and thinks that they know all about science, despite the fact that they themselves have not actually been in a lab environment, right?
Yes, that's exactly what I think of, because when I hear the term armchair magician, my brain goes straight to a very specific type of person that I have met mostly online. I feel like I only really interact with people that I would consider armchairs on the internet, right? Like there's a specific type of person on the occult internet who has read a lot of books, and it's there's this term I really like, and I'd like to explain this effect because I think it applies with armchair magicians, the people that we're actually talking about, called the Dunning-Krueger effect. It's a psychological thing where basically, and you can look up Dunning-Krueger effect and get a little like graph form of this, where basically when you have a little bit of information, you think you're a subject matter expert, right? Like once you have that bit of beginner information down, and it's called in the Dunning-Krueger effect the peak of Mount Stupid. And basically, once you know a little bit, you have a really high confidence level. And then you realize you don't know as much as you think you do, and you have this like crushing form of despair, hate you, called imposter syndrome. And then after that point, you slowly and surely start to actually develop real knowledge, right? And I think the armchair magician often is the peak of Mount Stupid, because it's these people who have not practiced really, or practiced only a little bit, who've read a lot of books. And typically, I've noticed armchair magicians are interested in the most esoteric, intellectual sounding occult books out there, right? They want to sound really, really smart. And so they've read a few of these books. Typically, I'm going to throw some shade. The books that armchair magicians tend to like are like The Keys of Solomon, books on Enochian, books on these like high forms of ceremonial magic that are really, really complicated to actually practice. They've read a bit of it. Sometimes they start memorizing things. They really like memorizing sections of Liber 777 by Crowley, right? And since they've read enough, they think they're really, really smart, and they condescend everyone else who are actual practitioners. And they tell people who actually practice regularly that they're doing things wrong. Typically because people who are regular practitioners are not always practicing exactly how those books go. And I think that's where this comes from. And I think the reason why armchair magician is such a term with an angry vibe to it is because people who are practitioners who've been doing this for years find it incredibly annoying when someone reads the Goetia and is like, why have you not bound all the demons? And I'm like, have you?
I don't think many people have bound all the demons, and usually I've never experienced it. I don't really experience it with the Goetia as much, but it's definitely one of the books that I was having somebody ask me about it earlier today, and somebody asked me, has anyone done this? And Dave, have you bound all the demons in the Goetia by the book. And I said, no, because that costs several $100,000 or a full blacksmithing setup. That's not exactly something that most normal people are going to be able to do, and let alone to the full specifications. Even if you get one thing wrong, a lot of armchair magicians will say, well, actually, you didn't do it properly. Because if you go to page 36 of, and they will continue to go on. One of the interesting things, though, is that if you actually read the books that they're trying to quote, the books actually often have methods of doing a cheaper, stripped down version that they just willfully ignore. My favorite example of this is actually in the Greater Key of Solomon. Most people know of the planetary metal associations with the Greater Key, and people will know of the colors, but there's actually an entire method for consecrating paper to make paper pentacles in the Greater Key of Solomon that a lot of people seem to either just not know or just don't think exists because they haven't read the book proper. And it also doesn't help that a lot of these old grimoires were written at a time when concise ordering of chapters was not a thing at all. So usually it's at like some weird chapter in the middle between consecrating candles and consecrating salt when you need to consecrate salt first. This is the kind of thing that you end up having when you are just focusing on books, because if you were trying to practice, you would know that, yeah, no, you can do this by the book, but doing it by the book is not going to be what people have in their mind as being by the book.
Yes, and I want to talk about another thing that comes in with this, in that you can work with these spirits in many contexts, and there is more to occultism than medieval Renaissance magic. And I think armchair magicians often hyperfixate on some point in time, right? They hyperfixate on one really specific part of metaphysics. And then when they go out in the community, especially if they go out into the real life community and they kind of have to leave their bubble, because I think the online occult community is divided into these little bubbles. And I try my best to have people come on my show from different bubbles. But like when you go out into the real world and you start meeting people at events or organizations, you're going to notice people practice really different stuff than what's cool on r/occult on Reddit, right? You're going to meet people who do completely different stuff. And so I think a lot of these armchair magicians would get a culture shock if they went deeper into the community and noticed that like not everyone does Solomonic magic. And in fact, out of all occultists I've met in the material world, I would actually say that's not the most popular practice out there.
If you do go outside and you deal with the actual practitioners and the actual practitioners in your local area, you're going to find that the local practitioners in your local area are going to practice basically a lot of, there's a good quote about this. The first laid plans never survive first contact with the enemy. And that basically means if you're going to do a plan, it doesn't matter how good your plan is, reality is going to break it the second it happens. So most practitioners are going to adapt the old grimoires if they're even practicing them at all. Most people don't practice out of books nearly as much as occult Twitter would have you believe. Most people, when they get to even a basic understanding, maybe you get a few successes. Maybe you've gotten one of those books, or maybe you found some videos on the internet teaching you about planetary magic and you end up researching it and trying it. Eventually, when you get even a moderate amount of success, you're going to develop a taste for a particular style of magic that might not be in the books. And that's just how personal practices end up going.
Yes. And you also are going to notice, and this is something that actually surprised me when I went out into the real world, and it is actually about the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram, which I think every single person and their mother knows about the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram. It's like the first ritual everyone learns, right? And what was so interesting to me is when I started going to real life rituals when I was like 18 in New York, I saw a lot of people do the LBRP or the Star Ruby, which is very similar to the LBRP in real life. And what I noticed is when I was actually watching different people perform it, is that they all did it slightly differently, right? And I noticed different styles of even performing the same ritual. Like some people who had more of like a yogic background, you could really hear them saying the things and that kind of like, you know what I'm saying? Like that type of vibraty tone. But then other
Yeah.
people who had that very ceremonial background, their vibration was completely different. And so it was two completely different ways of doing vibration. And you would never get that from the internet. And so what's interesting is when I talk about ritual and how I use certain invocations in certain ways, I'll get, and you want to know another thing about armchairs is they'll really nitpick people how they do things, right? And they won't realize that if you actually meet other occultists, you'll see actually a lot of variance, even with the exact same ritual.
I actually had this happen where so for a little bit of time I was recommending a book that I'm not going to say the name of, but in that book there is a version of the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram. Now, for those of you who don't know, there is two major versions of the ritual of the Lesser Ritual of the Pentagram, and that is the Thelemic version and the Golden Dawn version. And the major difference is you touch your solar plexus versus you touch your yesodal area. And that creates two different versions of the energy. So that it creates a different cross depending on where you're touching. And that is something that I actually had to explain. This is something I've never been able to find an armchair who can actually explain is when you are practicing and when you are actually engaging with your rituals, you end up learning how the ritual is performed and why the ritual is performed. So it's one thing to be like, oh, yeah, you're doing this wrong. But that's usually how armchairs will present it. And they'll say, because of the book, and they'll appeal to the book. And usually, when a practitioner is saying, no, I think you're doing this a little bit wrong, because of this practical thing and this aspect. And they'll cite different books in which you can find that evidence to support their claim, if they have a scholarly pursuit at all.
Exactly. And you know, there are some things, and this is the really the biggest argument against, well, there's a couple arguments against being an armchair if you are not someone who just has an intellectual interest in the occult. And I want to make it very clear, having an intellectual interest in the occult is completely fine. There is absolutely nothing wrong with having no desire to practice and just wanting to learn about this stuff because you find it interesting. There's nothing wrong with that. If that is what you do, I do not judge you. I think it's interesting stuff. I read about other religions just out of curiosity all the time, right? But if you are not practicing, I do not think you should police people who are practicing. And I think that is where a lot of the anger towards the armchair magician comes. If you're someone who just wants to discuss these ideas, like there's a lot of people I interact with who just are like interested. They'll be like, I want to read Crowley to understand what he thought. I just think it's interesting that people do all this stuff. Like it's kind of like a fascination and a subculture, right? Totally
Yeah.
cool. I don't. No one is crapping on those people. And if someone is crapping on, like, if you're someone who listens to my show and that's who what you are, anyone who is judging you for that is just a dick. Um, but in terms of like, if you want to actually learn the occult on a deeper level and engage with it in your life, you can't do that while just reading material because a lot of these things don't unfold until you experience them, right? Like reading the text of a ritual and doing a ritual are completely different experiences. And there are some things about the occult that I believe you can only learn through direct experience as a practitioner.
And that's actually like in occult books. That actually what you just said of there are certain things you can only learn through experience. I believe it's the Hermeticum says this, that certain things can only be experienced through experience, and you can only learn certain things through experience. And that's in that book, I believe it's given the term gnosis, which gnosis is thrown around in the occult community quite often. But this is what I usually say when I say gnosis is untransferable knowledge. You cannot learn everything just by reading a book. You actually need to engage it because the map is not the territory. And when it comes to the occult, there is no clearer map than a grimoire that is perfectly bullet pointed, telling you exactly what ingredients you need, exactly what time of day, and what planetary hour, and what candle color you need, and everything like that. that is a perfectly good and reasonable map. But if you do a ritual and that ritual is to, work with a particular god, and you end up having a problem with that particular god and the writer doesn't, that's going to be completely different. And this is why when it comes to armchair magicians, practitioners particularly do not like armchair magicians. And we don't like armchair practitioners because they tell us what to do, and we've engaged with the material and we've gotten that experience. And then it's like, to have that experience condescended to by somebody who willingly does not want to engage it and just wants to kind of use it as a bit of a power trip, it feels like sometimes. It's arguing in bad faith. Now, if you are one of those people who just loves the design of occult books, because let's be real, occult books have a very, very strong aesthetic, and the really good ones look fantastic. I have an entire bookshelf of occult books, and I have an entire second pile of occult books that are books I reference constantly, and those books look beautiful. But if you're one of those people who just has an interest in the occult and is trying to look and enjoy the aesthetic of the occult librarian, uh, that is when the armchair magician is not really applied. And no one should be besmirched for that at all, I don't think. But you do need to go and experience the actual practices. And that can be big. Beginning to become a practitioner is a big step, and um usually people don't willingly practice in the occult just out of curiosity, I've noticed.
No, because the desire to just be interested in something and the desire to experience it are completely different desires, right? I think that, if you read this stuff and you just think it's cool, versus if you read this stuff and you're like, I want to do that, right? Like when I heard about the occult and I found out it was real, I felt an immediate desire to do the thing. I was like, okay, I'm going to make this my thing, right? I'm going to commit to this. I'm going to experience that. That's a completely different impulse than like when I read about certain things or philosophies or lifestyles or whatever, and I'm just like, that's really interesting. I want to understand these people because they seem cool to me and they're so different than my lived experience, right? Those
Yep.
are different desires, completely different desires. And I think you need to know where you stand if you're someone who's new to the occult and you're reading about this stuff, because I do think there is a phase when you first find out about this stuff. For some people, it wasn't for me because I kind of immediately knew, but it's this phase of discernment where you're not sure what you want to do with this information. And I think also there is the second thing where there are a lot of people who hear about this stuff and they are skeptical, right? Like they're like, okay, well, that's a little out there for me, but this is cool. It's interesting that there's all these people who do this. Maybe there's something to that, but I'm not really sure. Like there's that phase too. And I think all of these things are kind of complicated, and I think you need to know where you stand. Um, yeah. Also, one thing I wanted to circle back that you said earlier is I think it is also worth mentioning that people are gonna relate to gods differently and spirits differently. I think people who are armchairs read about all these different spirits in this like catalog way, because many of these books, especially these older ones, feel like spirit catalogs. And they don't realize that when you are in a ritual space, you are having a relationship with that spirit, right? You are relating to them directly. And people relate to spirits very differently. Even the same spirit, like my relation, Dave and I have both worked with Hecate, right? We have very, very different relationships to Hecate, right?
Yes.
Completely different experiences, like night and day. And that's because we're different people and we're doing different things. We have different wills and we have different metaphysical makeups. And so I think there's a thing to be said about people who just read about it and don't experience it, where it seems almost clinical or catalog based. And that's not how these experiences actually go when you set out to have them.
And even just between two practitioners, I between the two of us, because we talk about this a lot. Hecate is one of the notable ones, but I can probably name off four different spirits that we have radically different impressions of and experiences with. Now, some of our experiences are very similar, but a lot of our experiences, I can ask you about a spirit and I can ask you, hey, what do you think about this? Like, what do you think about Mercury? Mercury being the planetary power. And you would give me a completely different answer than half of the friends I know who work with Mercury, right? Everyone's impression is going to be a little bit different, but there's also going to be key similarities, right? And I would very strongly advise, because I've made this mistake, don't just look at the gods and think, oh, I want to work with this because I think this energy would be really good, or this energy I think would work really well with me. Because I've actually had a moment where I went through and I planned a ritual, and this was to get in touch with one of the gods. And then I did the full ritual to, you know, do the operation to get in contact with this god, and the god immediately told me off and basically said, here's all the problems with working with me. You have no desire to actually work with me. You want to work with this instead. Don't call me again until you have changed this outlook. And I've never called that god again. But if I had not gone through that experience, I would still be thinking, oh, me and this energy are very compatible. You're not going to be compatible with everything, even if you read about it and think you're going to be compatible, just because, just because you think something doesn't mean it's true. That's a weird thing about the occult. Intention is often said as being important. And there is a little bit of, I subscribe to a little bit of magical realism. There is some underlying truth to magic as a whole that causes things to not always work out the way that you're expecting, even if you're going to go through an operation. Even if you think you're going to have a bad experience and you're kind of being pushed by other things in your spiritual life towards doing something, maybe that is because that thing is actually beneficial to you and you just don't know it because you think on a conscious level that, oh, this is going to be negative for me, and when in actuality it's actually like kind of like exercising in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Like when I was really deep in Thelema, I felt like I should have a very strong relationship to Babylon, right? Because I'm a Thelemite and I'm a woman. And at the time, I reached out to Babylon, and she and I really did not vibe that well, right? It didn't really work. And I remember I felt weird about that because I'm like, oh, well, I'm supposed to have a positive relationship with the spirit. Then I reached out to Nuit instead, and that actually went a lot better. And then, years later, I recently realized Babylon and I's energies now work. And that's because I needed to go through some spiritual development for that to happen, right? Your spiritual path is not going to work exactly how you think it's going to go. And I think some of this assumption that these spirits are supposed to work with you, this one's going to make sense for me, like all this thinking, I think it's almost like devaluing the autonomy and agency of these spirits as like autonomous beings. I think in general, people have a tendency to have a very human centric view of the universe, which is understandable because we're humans, but
Mm-hmm.
that's not how things actually work. And I think there is some arrogance that we sometimes have as a cultist that often many people need to work through.
I think one of the things I repeat on the channel the most is you're not really a full occultist if you don't have some horrible, like, if you don't have some funny, humorous stories of you messing a ritual up or something going unexpected during a ritual. I think I have some on the channel that I share, but it really is true because the spirits, like, when you are engaging with this stuff and when you are engaging with this material, if you are focusing on the spiritual aspect of it, you're not going to have all of the information. You're not going to know what the spirit's attitude towards you is going to be unless you have worked with them before. And it is kind of an arrogant thing of, well, of course this energy would want to work with me. I'm me. Why wouldn't it want to work with me? I'm great. But they don't know you. They don't know you at first. You need to develop that relationship. And some relationships just aren't going to work when you first try to get those relationships. Um, and some of those relationships are not really uh, intentionally caused by you. They sometimes the spirit world comes knocking, which is a big part of certain relationships that I have with goddesses that start with an H.
You think talking about ritual mistakes, I actually think there are some things worth discussing in this conversation that we haven't gotten into. And I think that is why people are armchair magicians. Like,
Mm,
we've discussed what they are, but why do they exist? And I actually think one of the more common reasons why people are armchair magicians is actually that. Like, it's a fear that they're going to try a ritual and it's going to go really horribly wrong. Because I've talked to a lot of people who want to get into the occult and they've like read everything. Like, these people have read honestly like more books than I have, and I've been doing this for a very long time. Um, and they just the reason why they haven't practiced and they just read books is that they're scared that they're going to do something wrong, right? They don't want to mess up. And I think that's actually one of the more common reasons why people end up in the armchair. And it's not one that people often talk about because a lot of people don't want to admit that they have fears, right? And the truth is that you can make mistakes spiritually, but often those mistakes are not as catastrophic as I think people worry they are. And if you're moving at a reasonable pace and not jumping straight to advanced stuff, you're very unlikely to make a mistake that's going to cause you serious issues. But why do you think people are armchairs? 'Cause I think there's honestly like a few key motivations behind it.
well, I think we touched on some of the reasons. Personally, I think that first of all, like it is, they do try to use it as like fodder for Twitter arguments. Let's be real. Some people just want to argue. Some people want to be considered knowledgeable. They don't really have a good understanding of the occult because, let's be honest, most people don't have a good understanding of the occult. They read all the scholarly books and then they proceed to use it to condescend to people because they want to feel better about themselves. But in the good faith category, there is also a group of people who do want to practice, but failure is, the society we live in, failure is not only frowned upon, it is often looked down upon in such a way to where you only need one success and it will override most of your failures, right? If you look at the way people are treated, like failure is not considered a good thing in our modern day world. But failure is a necessary part of learning. You need to fail in order to learn bigger lessons, right? So if you're not allowing yourself to fail, you do end up in that armchair in occult terms because you end up in the armchair because, oh no, I failed a ritual. I guess this stuff doesn't work, but I have all these books, so I might as well just keep reading the books. And you kind of dig your heels in a little bit and you become an armchair because clearly you did something wrong and you're trying to steer people off of that path. That is a much more well-intentioned version of the armchair. I think we can agree. But there's also the group of people who I really hate the Goetia as a first occult book, and I've said this multiple times.
It shouldn't be a first occult book.
It
It's not a
absolutely should
beginner
not
book.
be. It's a terrible first occult book because it requires, most people don't realize that the Goetia is a more advanced book on occultism. Like it's the equivalent of jumping into the deep end when you don't know how to swim, and then you manage to do everything that is for the prep, but then you can't swim, so you don't end up having good results, right? And then you think, well, I did all the things in the book and then nothing happened, or I didn't see anything happen, so it must not be real. When you actually need some fairly high level techniques and a decent grasp of some fairly difficult things for occultists in general, let alone a beginner, in order to do full blown proper spirit evocation the way most of the old grimoires list it out. So you start out with that and then you end up failing, and then it's no wonder that you feel bad about failing because you have this really popular book that everyone recommends and it's your first occult book and you just can't do it,
Yeah,
right?
and you want to know the hard truth? The Goetia is not the best book for spiritual growth because there are actually a lot of other ways that are one, less complicated, and two, more I would say conduitive to interpersonal growth and mysticism than the Goetia. I actually don't even think it's the best book. I don't work with it myself in my practice, which I know is shocking to some people, but it's not what I work with. Um, and I mean, I've done it before, but it's not my thing for a reason. It's not my regular practice. I think another reason why people end up armchairs is because they have unrealistic expectations of the path forward. I think people go straight to these books because they're flashy and exciting, right? The Goetia, Enochian, all these things are very exciting. And when you read about the famous occultists like Crowley and stuff, they all did this. So you want to jump straight to that. And the truth is, if you want to have a good practice, you need to start with the foundations. If you want to read like a big occult book as your first book, I'm going to say Black Brick Golden Dawn is probably a much better option because that actually has a curriculum of linear progression. Because to be a good occultist and to get out of the armchair, you need to have proper linear progression because you cannot build a house with no foundations, right? You need to develop these foundational skills in order to get to those really exciting books. And the people who work with those really exciting books don't put away those foundational skills. If you want to be a good practitioner, you're going to keep those foundational skills up your entire practice. That means the boring stuff. That means keeping doing your banishing, keeping doing your meditation, visualization, all these things that people think are boring or oversimplistic or for beginners. Like, you're always going to still be doing that. And so I think if you're an armchair magician and you're only reading the Goetia or books like that, right, the flashy ones, first of all, it's not going to explain these foundations to you. So you're honestly, if you just start with the Goetia, just following the instruction, you're not going to know what the hell you're doing. Even if you're following it by the book exactly and you have all the materials and all that, you're not going to know those other things that make an experience work. And you're not going to know where to go next. And you're not going to have had the mysteries unravel in the order they're meant to unravel. You are meant to progress in a specific order. In the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which I'm going to say Black Brick, it's a great, great first book, actually. They
It
don't
really
teach
is.
Enochian until super late in that book. That means years and years into Golden Dawn practice, you're not supposed to even touch Enochian, right?
Even in solitary Golden Dawn books that I've personally read, you don't get to Enochian until like the very back parts of the book because they assume that modern day Golden Dawn approach for solitary magicians, at least from what I've read, usually says that Enochian is not something beginners should be messing with. And the fact that they were messing with it at the beginning of the original Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is kind of a misstep that a lot of authors I've seen have kind of said. Now, whether you believe that fully is up to you. But generally speaking, in the books I've read, you don't do Enochian until like the very end. Most of it is, if you're going to be doing things, it's going to be you're going to be working yourself up to more advanced stuff. You're going to be starting with the LBRP and the middle pillar and meditation. Meditation is so downplayed in the modern occult scene that unless you get to a point where for some reason you don't need to do meditation regularly, right? And there are some rituals that do facilitate that. You need to be meditating at least daily or even weekly at the bare minimum. I say dailies are kind of important. I think daily practice is like where you should be striving for, but I know that's not always possible.
Yeah, and also I think something that gets missed in these conversations is that you still get profound breakthroughs with the beginner stuff, with the foundation stuff. You could spend your entire spiritual life just doing meditation, and there are people who do this. They like live in like monk monasteries in the Far East and they literally just meditate forever, and they have the craziest spiritual breakthroughs. You know what I mean? Like there's a quote Crowley said, and I'm gonna paraphrase it because I don't have it memorized, where like just going on your knees and like crying out to the gods can get you almost as good results as some really complex rituals. And I think until you understand that, you really shouldn't move forward. Until you can explain what you're doing to someone, I don't think you should be doing it. And I think with people, they forget that like the non-flashy stuff can get results. You do not have to be doing Enochian 15,000 times a day to be getting profound mystic results. And I'm not knocking these more complex systems. I think you should aspire to these more complex systems, but that's not where you should be beginning. These should not be where you start. You can read these books early on. I don't think that's a problem, but like, you shouldn't be just jumping in. Like, you can't run before you can walk. And I think a lot of people who are armchair magicians want to run before they can walk, but then they get intimidated by running because they don't know how to walk. And so nothing happens. And if they would have just like gone in order, they'd be running way before they actually start running because they're not doing anything because they're not ready. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy and a cycle. And then you get more wedged into being an armchair. And at that point, what can you do with your occult interest? Argue with people on r/occult. Like, that's all you can do. And so it's actually not productive for you to be doing it this way. It's not efficient. And at the end of the day, why do we do occultism? Is the question that you need to be asking yourself. Why am I doing this? The great work, true will, mysticism, theosis, gnosis. Pick your answer. You're not going to achieve those goals until you start putting in the work and putting in that work for a purpose. You should not be doing rituals for the sake of doing rituals. You should be doing them for an actual purpose. And that
And
is what a lot of this conversation that people have about the subject misses. We do occultism for a reason, and you need to understand and know those reasons. That's why I do like Thelema as a system, because Thelema gives you a very clear answer to that question, right? True will. And then if you understand the idea of true will, you're like, oh, okay, that's why I do these rituals. You don't have to have that answer. You don't have to do Thelema, but you need to be thinking about like what your answer is, right? Why do you want to do Goetia? Like, ask yourself, like, what about this appeals to me, and how will this get me to my actual goals? And then when you consider how do I get to my actual goals, make like a actual plan on how to get there. And there are so many occult books and organizations that have created like straight up curriculum and orders of progression so you can understand how to actually achieve those goals. But you don't want to rush the process, right? That process unfolds over time for a reason, because we're having initiatic experiences and those ripple out into our entire lives. And so there's no point in rushing this process. You need to trust the process and let it go as it goes, or you will not get the end goal that you want, because we're doing this stuff for a reason. It's not just for the sake of it. And you need to think about your why. That's like a very important question to be asking yourself and answering. And that's why a foundation that I suggest everyone have is a contemplative practice, a time where you just take to think about your life, think about your goals, think about what you want and how to get there.
it's important to realize that, initiation, there's a lot of different types of initiation. And one of the things about initiation that I think a lot of people don't realize is that you don't need to do initiation, but you should, because it makes everything better. Like, all of your magic after you've done the initiations becomes better than when you started. And you don't even need to be initiated. Sigil magic requires no initiations. And I've seen, and everyone has probably heard of, people who have entire sigil magic sections of their practice that cause incredible results for them. But that all that takes is a piece of paper, a pen, and some decent creative writing skills. And they don't even need to be that decent, let's be real. Sigil magic is very simple. But when it comes to the contemplative practice, and when it comes to the basic practice, you do need to establish something, and those do give profound experiences. You'd be surprised. We mentioned the Black Bright Golden Dawn, the complete. I think it's the Complete Golden Dawn by Israel Regardi is the actual name. And one of those, the practice is just stare at a point on a wall, and that's the meditation. And I've had people who I've been talking to who are working through various different Golden Dawn related material, and they will come to me and they'll be like, "Hey, Dave, is this really profound thing that I got while meditating on a point true?" And I'll have to just say, "Yeah, that's the entire point of the exercise, is to get to that level of understanding, because you can." And that practice in and of itself is to teach you that you do get the most profound knowledge and the most profound understanding from the smallest things. It's kind of weird. We like to overcomplicate things, right? We like all of the fancy grimoires that have a bajillion steps for summoning, goetic entity number 86, right? But they're not really necessary for great spiritual growth. Some of the best spiritual growth you can have is just sitting down, meditating, calming down and realizing that, you don't need all these books, or there's a better way for you personally to be engaging with the material you're reading because of another book you might have read, or and that interplay there. And that goes along with the fact that there is no Goetia spirit number 87 or 83 or whatever I said. That's not real.
Yeah, because something being more complicated doesn't always make it better. And even if you are someone like we both do ceremonial practice, we both do the really complicated stuff.
Our
Even if
practices
you
look
practice,
wildly different too.
oh yeah, yeah, our practices are night and day. We do completely different stuff, but like we both do complicated stuff. But not everything we do is complicated. Like there are other parts of my practice that are very, very simple, right? You do, if you're someone who is a ceremonial practitioner, you still do other things. There are still other things that go into that. Not every single spiritual experience you have is like the most complex thing you've ever done, right? That's not really how it goes.
And as someone who has done those big ceremonial practices, one of the things that most people don't talk about is saying a bunch of psalms repeatedly in some of the old grimoires. That takes a long time, and that burns you out if you're doing that way too consistently.
Yes. And there's also the risk, and this is something that we've talked about. I don't know if we've talked about it online, of Magusitis, where you are essentially doing the adrenaline junkie approach to spirituality, where you're like constantly doing these super crazy rituals to the point where you actually become ungrounded and you start like getting actually kind of spiritually messed up because you're not grounding, you're not recentering yourself in the material world. And that actually creates whole problems, right? Like if someone tells me they're doing like, I mean, for some reason, it's always Enochian. It's always people who get really fucking into Enochian. They're
It's
like,
Neo Enochiana.
yeah, it's always that one, or like Kabbalah or something. And they're like, I do 15,000 rituals a day and I cross the abyss twice a week. Why can I not focus at my job? And I'm like, well, maybe you're doing too much. And I think often I run into people who are doing too little, who need to focus on things like discipline. But the other extreme exists too. Like you can cause problems by just not doing the basics for yourself.
Yeah, not doing the basics and trying to overload yourself by, you know, going on a vision quest through every Enochian Aether in one single week is probably not a good idea for anyone, let alone beginners. And this is where you end up frying yourself out. Like, spiritual burnout is very real, and it's important to have something to ground yourself into reality. And that will look different from person to person, right? It's, one person's reading books and just kind of going into that fantasy world will be very grounding for them, and another person might need to go hiking, or another person might have this entire garden that they need to tow, and they will go through and do various different things. It will look different for every single person, but you should have some kind of anchor to reality and to the mundane world so that you can go out, touch grass, and be normal. Your life shouldn't just be, I am so esoteric in the corner of the room, and you're actually exhausted mentally because you decided that you would summon like four of the highest level archangels to full manifestation at the right planetary hour because you thought it would be cool, or whatever your reason would be. And usually the reason, it's kind of an insidious thing, because usually when you do get on this high level magic bent, it is because you want to find the truth. And the truth is, you keep looking higher and you keep looking higher, and, well, what if there's a more truthier truth? A lot of people in ceremonial magic get really hung up on what the truthiest truth of the truths is, right? We want to know what's really going on. And so we keep looking for higher tier magic. This is one of the big appeals for Enochian for a lot of people. It is the highest magical system that we have in the West, according to a lot of people. But one of the things that most people don't realize is that if you read the diaries of Dr. John Dee, even the things that Dr. John Dee was talking to these really high level spirits for was usually money. He wanted to borrow money from the angels, and the angels got sick, and that's why they gave him Enochian, right?
Yeah, and one thing I want to ask you, because I think this is the final sort of note this conversation should get into, is If you're listening to all of this and you're like, holy shit, I'm an armchair magician, I want to change, how do you get out of the armchair?
So I actually have like a little tier system that I like to go through. And the first thing you should do is meditate. Meditation, step zero. If you don't have a good meditative practice, your spiritual practice is dead in the water. So start with that. Two, if you want to make sure magic is real, just do sigil magic. It's not that hard. If you practice with meditation and sigil magic, you can do some very, very basic magic and you can get results that will shock you, as long as you're practicing safe sigil magic and the like. The third thing is don't, don't, whatever you do not buy too many books. This is completely contradictory to what a lot of magicians are going to tell you. Pick one really big book or find a really, really well reputed book and stick with that for a while. There's a tendency of people to get overwhelmed by the amount of occult content, especially occult beginner content, which is a whole nother problem. And when you have all this beginner content, it can cause you to dig a lot of small holes instead of a lot of deep holes. You want to dig one deep hole, lay the foundation, and that will become the foundation of your practice, right? And from there, after you have that foundation laid for your practice, then look into experimenting with these other books. Read what these other books have to say, even if you might not like them, because there's a lot of books that people are recommended at the beginning that they're not ready for. My favorite book that I personally reference a lot that beginners should not read as their first occult book is the Three Books of Occult Philosophy by Agrippa. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa is very dry, he is very bland, and if you read him as the first occult book, it is going to completely break you a little bit because you are going to read modern occult books and you're going to read even Golden Dawn related occult books and go, wait a minute, why are they doing this thing that Agrippa says is completely backwards? And there are reasons for it, but it goes into that, and that is one of the problems. You need to stick with a couple of smaller sources. Don't overload yourself with information, right? If you want to get into practice, meditation, sigil magic, work yourself up to candle magic, and then eventually, if you get to the point where you can meditate and work on scrying, that kind of thing, then maybe consider working with something that is more generally beneficial, like the gods or angels, instead of the Goetia, because the Goetia is a landmine of a book.
Yeah, I think my advice would be to start with developing discipline. I really stress this because I think this is very important. I think a daily practice that's small is very, very valuable. I think meditation is the first one you should do. And then something like the LBRP, I recommend it a lot because it's good. Or the Star Ruby or whatever, like something that's a daily practice. And I think incrementally increasing what you do is the key. Because if you do a lot at once, you're going to burn out really fast. It's not going to be consistent. Small change makes the most long term progress. And so, doing a daily small ritual, just literally banishing once a day, meditating for 5 minutes, and then once a month, every full moon, do a larger ritual, right? Or every full and new moon, or maybe like one day a week. Like maybe you want to worship Venus, right? So you say the Orphic hymn to Venus on Friday, every Friday, and then leave a rose offering, like some roses or something. Something like that, and then work up to those things over time. I also think if you are really struggling with getting out of the armchair, seeking out community might benefit you. Maybe you're someone who needs structure. And if you need structure, joining a group might be a better approach for you, right? Um, for some people that's kind of what they need. For some people they're very solitary and they never want to be part of a group, but for some people that might actually be valuable. There are structured learning things like the AA, which is a thelemic organization that can really help people get out of the armchair, and I think a lot of armchairs would like that because there's a big study component to that organization. But there's a lot of ways, like if you're struggling on your own, like there are other people who can help you get past that point, who will want to learn with you and help you grow.
Absolutely. And one of the things about the discipline that really is understated is that discipline kind of is a little bit of a dirty word in modern day. But discipline in the occult is really important because one of the things that people don't realize is if the spirits and the gods see that you are actively putting in discipline, they will respond to you better. They just will. It's because you're putting in the work. It's that there's that wonderful quote of God meets you halfway. The discipline is you meeting God halfway.
Absolutely. As my sort of absolute final thing I want to discuss, what do you think the biggest mistake people make getting out of the armchair is, just so people listening to this know what not to do?
Well, you mentioned at the beginning of this the Dunning Krueger effect. And the Dunning Krueger effect, if you are in the armchair, you are going to be at the top of Mount Stupid, the top of Mount Ignorance. And the second when you start practicing, you're going to fall into that pit of. You're going to fall into that pit of, oh God, I don't know anything. I don't know what I don't know anymore. Right. And eventually, and that's scary. That is a terrifying feeling. But the sooner you get into that pit, the sooner you can get out. And that's really the important thing.
Absolutely. And once you get into that pit, just know we've all been there. Like every single person has had that moment. You are not uniquely bad. You are not uniquely not a good occultist. And try to avoid despair because that is a metaphysical state as well as an emotion. So just know like this is normal, right? Your spiritual path includes a lot of things that are unpleasant and not exciting and not flashy and not cool, right? There's a lot of things that are not like the aesthetic of the movie The Love Witch that are part of this world. And that's okay because fundamentally, what we are attempting to do, no matter whether you want to achieve apotheosis or gnosis or theosis or annihilation of the self, whatever it is your actual goal is, no matter what that goal is, you're gonna have to really transform yourself. And transforming the self can only happen with suffering and difficulty and trial. But these trials are ultimately for good. And so every single practitioner, including the ones you look up to, including the ones who never talk about their spiritual struggles, and I'm trying to be a little more open about my spiritual struggles because I think that can be helpful and enlightening for people, but all of us have them. And I think that you need to realize that's normal. And I think realizing that, like every single person you look up to goes through this stuff too, can be a very comforting thought,
And
right?
it's
This is hard.
one of those things of there's a quote that I've said on my channel a couple times, so people who've seen me over there will probably remember this one. Uh, every good magician has failed more times than the beginner has even tried. And that goes double for occultists because our let's be honest, our field of study is, if you can call it that, is a lot more experiential. We do need to experience all of the things that we are working with and make sure that we are actually learning how to deal with those things in a way that fits. And we're going to fail a lot. You're going to fail a lot. I have failed a lot. Georgina, I think you can agree that you have failed a lot, right?
True. Real.
Everyone has failed. Every occultist you look up to that actually practices has failed so often in usually hilarious and embarrassing ways that we just don't want to talk about, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a humbling moment just to make you feel a little better, as the last thing I'm going to say. When I was a newer practitioner, I did a love spell on this guy. I'm going to make a fake name because I don't want to actually cause real drama in my life. Um, John, right? Did the love spell on John, didn't add the last name. I started getting hit on by another guy named John. So yeah, good life choice I made there. So
Always the
we all
love
fuck up.
spells.
Where can people find you, Dave? Where do you exist on the internet?
I am Dave, the Amateur Magus. I am on basically everywhere as Amateur Magus, sometimes with an underscore, sometimes not. You can find me on the site formerly known as Twitter. I'm primarily on YouTube. I also have a Patreon and Instagram that I don't use, but I always respond to messages on, and that is basically where you can find me.
Absolutely. I am Georgina Rose. I am on every platform under the sun under the name Dot Darling. This is the Postmodern Iconoclast. If you are listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. And if you are listening on a podcasting platform, please leave a review, unless it is a bad review, in which case do not leave a review. This show is supported through Patreon. On the Patreon, you get a bonus episode 8 times a year, early access to all my episodes, and a pre-show, which is like a 10-minute mini episode with every single episode. The pre-shows are solo episodes. My guests are not on the pre-shows. That's just me. And yeah, thank you so much for listening to the pod. And I will see you all next time. Have an amazing day, night, morning, mid-evening, mid-afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you are.